This podcast is sponsored by A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. By Hyde Park Care Pharmacy. Experience the difference an independent pharmacy can make for you and your loved ones. Hyde Park Care Pharmacy offers personalized care, short wait time, very competitive pricing, easy transfer of your prescription, and much more. And by Molly Maid. During these times of COVID-19, it has never been more important to keep your family safe. With the Healthy Home Cleaning System, Molly Maid London is here to help. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. Today, we welcome Dr. Yolanda Pierce. Dr. Pierce is Dean of the Howard University School of Divinity in Washington, D.C. She is the first woman to be appointed as Dean in the Divinity School's 150-year history. In 2016, Dr. Pierce served as the founding director of the Center for African American Religious Life at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. Her book, entitled In My Grandmother's House, is a testimony to the power of a grandmother's theology that carries wisdom strong enough for the future generations. Dr. Pierce asserts that the divine has been showing up at the kitchen tables of Black women for a long time. It's time to get to know that God. We discuss her book, the deaths of Daunte Wright and George Floyd, and so much more.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you may be listening. We welcome you back to another edition of the Vicar's Crossing podcast. The Vicar's Crossing is a virtual space where faith intersects with the public square. And my name is Rob Henderson, back for another episode. I am the rector and priest at Holy Trinity St. Stephen's in London, Ontario.
How are we doing, Robbie? My name is Kevin. I'm vicar too. I'm at Kevin George, Revy Kevy. I've been called a lot of names, an incredible amount of names over the years. But I'll answer to most anything. But I'm at St. Aidan's Anglican Church here in Northwest London, where I hang out with my digital deacon, who's here with us.
My name is Ian. I'm a singer-songwriter and producer of a lot of things. It's digital deacon is a new title. That's definitely a new one.
We needed something to call the guy who gets our faces out to the public on Sundays during these pandemic times. And that's an act of service, which is a diaconate, a deacon. And it's digital, so we thought he should be a digital deacon. What do you think, Robbie? Is it a good?
I love it, and I want to get the shirt with the DD on it and the cape.
Yeah,
I'll take it.
That's right, man. He's off to the races.
I like it. Well, we're here with a bonus episode, folks. This week, we will be welcoming best-selling author and speaker and the professor and dean of Howard University School of Divinity, which is in Washington. The Reverend Dr. Yolanda Pierce will be joining us today to discuss things, including her book, which is entitled In My Grandmother's House. So we'll bring in Dr. Pierce here in just a little bit.
Yeah, she's going to be great. And in light of, we couldn't have known this when we booked her, but I mean, here we are right after Daunte Wright now in Minneapolis. Yeah. So we'll want to get her thoughts on that. And as we consider these issues around race, we want to acknowledge here on the Vicar's Crossing the land upon which we record this podcast. The Vicar's Crossing acknowledges that our podcast is recorded on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenapehoak, and Attawandaron peoples, on the lands connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant, Wampum. This land continues to be a home to a diverse Indigenous people, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of this land and vital contributors of our society. And we, along with many of you who listen, are working to hear, to listen, to learn, and to work towards reconciliation.
Very good. Thank you. And apparently we have a fourth
co-star
crew member on the
look at that
today.
Yeah,
So
kitty.
someone just joined the party. There we go.
I didn't realize that Wesley was in my room.
Well,
Yes,
listen to those of you who listen to this and don't watch it. There is a feline now joined the podcast. I'm having memories of Elf.
Oh, right.
Lucky.
There he goes, out the door. Ian's
Here, kitty,
okay,
kitty,
good.
kitty, kitty.
That's good. Want to say thanks to our sponsors and hello again to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family owned and operated. Our thanks to Dave Mullen, and we say hi to all the staff today at A. Miller George.
Hey, Dave. How you doing? Also, a big thanks going out to Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, locally owned, locally operated, locally loved, and to our friend Carol Basada, the pharmacist and owner there. She's expecting a child very soon, and so we continue to keep Carol in our prayers and give thanks for what she's doing to support us in getting the word out there around faith in the public square. So thank you, Carol.
And last but certainly not least, you want to say a huge thank you to Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. If you got cat hair going everywhere, ring them up.
I know
man.
you do.
Yeah, and
Right.
Trisha Lister was the one that hooked us up with that. So,
Oh, well,
yeah.
She's good with getting rid of cat hair, right?
Oh, for sure.
Okay, good. That's good.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you to all of our sponsors for their great support to the podcast. So guys, it's if you're listening to this today, it's either the 18th of April or beyond, but we are recording today on the eve or first day of Ramadan right now. And our Muslim brothers and sisters are celebrating and entering into that holy season for them. So we want to recognize that and wish them a gracious Ramadan as they begin.
Yeah, I mean it's a big season for them. Not dissimilar in ways to Lent, although the level of fasting is certainly ramped up.
That's right.
As a fasting all day, but we want to wish a Ramadan Mubarak to everybody in the London Muslim Mosque and beyond, and to our listeners around the world who are observing this holy season as you journey towards Eid. We hold you in our prayers, and we give thanks for your witness to obedience and almsgiving and fasting that you display each year at this time. The amount of good works that are done in this community by our Muslim brothers and sisters are just incredible, and those are ramped up during Ramadan, and we're most grateful. So our love goes out to our friends at the mosque. A shout out to Imam Abd al-Fatah Tawakkul and Dr. Munir al-Kazam and others known to us. We give thanks for your ongoing work here in this community, and know that as you journey in this holy season, we journey with you.
And I don't know if you saw it, but I shared and I saw a little video that was made. I think it was on the CBC website. It was a video by some local Muslim students in the high schools who put together kind of a video about explaining what Ramadan is and what the season is and what it means and some of the disciplines around that. I thought that was really well done, and it's nice to see them doing that and sharing that for those that just may not know or want to find out more. It's
well, we'll pop that one up on our Facebook page. So folks, take a look at our. We'll get it from Robbie. We'll put it on our Facebook page. So
we can do that.
Those of you who want to know more about Ramadan, this will certainly be a help.
Okay. Well, look, just before we bring Dr. Pierce in today, we're going to play another round of.
It's not a lie if you believe it.
Georgie.
It's not a lie.
It's not a lie if you believe it.
If you believe it. What is this, Rob? What are we doing?
So,
this?
We're going to tell, one of us is going to tell a little story about themselves, and it'll be up to the other two to try to figure out whether it's a true story or perhaps whether they may be trying to pull the wool over our eyes today. But remember, if it is a lie and this person is lying and they believe it,
okay,
it's really not a lie.
Okay.
We're going to give them that. So Kevin's up today.
Okay. So the story I'm going to tell you today, and it's not a lie if I believe it, is about when I met my wife, Catherine Ann. So we will have been married 25 years coming up next month.
Congratulations.
Yep. And which represents half of my lifetime, because I'll soon be 50. So that's half of my life with Catherine. and so grateful, of course. But when I met Catherine Ann, I was at Huron College, and she was at St. Peter's Seminary. And so I have the distinction of saying that I got a wife at a Roman Catholic seminary. That's not easy to do, okay? Because there's not a lot of women in Roman Catholic seminaries. I'm just telling you.
Not a lot.
Okay?
Not a lot to do, yeah.
So, but that's where we met. And our first date, I met her in church Okay, here's the story. We met in the chapel. Well, we talked afterwards, but there was a church service in the chapel at Huron College, and I read from Isaiah. And when she heard me read, she was like, I got to have this guy. Like, this guy is amazing. Like this. And I was wearing my teal suit with the purple tie. I mean,
oh, nice.
like, it's just, I mean, it was a picture of 1994. Okay. It was an incredible time. And anyway, she was like, who is that guy? You know? And so I got to meet her afterwards and all that. And so here's the deal. Our first date was in Stratford, and the play we went to see was an afternoon matinee called Cyrano de Bergerac.
Mm-hmm.
And we went out afterwards so here's the story. We went out afterwards to East Side Mario's, because that felt like a big dinner out for students, right? Because we were both,
Bada
we were
boom,
both
bada bing.
students. Hey, bada boom, bada bing. And it's not even there anymore, but there was an East Side Mario's on the outskirts of Stratford there. And we went for dinner. And I was so nervous about being out on a date with her that my bowels acted up. And I had to go to the bathroom like nonstop. So the whole dinner was me going back and forth to the bathroom, like, and having to stop at a bathroom on the way back and the whole thing. That was our first date, and she still stayed with me. That's my story.
True.
Yeah, I feel like it's if you're lying, like, why?
No, I've been to Stratford with Kevin before and had a similar
Similar
incident.
experience?
So there might be something about the water in Stratford. I don't know.
It could be. It could be. So you're both saying
so
true. Then.
I would say that's true. I could see that perhaps, you know, nerves, right?
Yeah.
You want to make a good impression. You're getting a little nervous.
Spaghetti didn't help.
The spaghetti didn't help.
It was like a meatball. It was like meatballs from Niagara Falls. Well, it is in fact true. Everything I just said is true.
Of course.
There's not one part of that whole story, from the Roman Catholic Seminary to the teal suit and the purple tie and the going to Stratford and Cyrano de Bergerac and me crying in the middle of Cyrano de Bergerac because I'd never been in a theater that big and the whole thing, to me having to go to the bathroom nonstop during dinner. It's all true, and she married me anyway.
So was it the Old Testament or the incontinence that really kind of turned it for?
I don't know what did it. It was. It may have been Isaiah, and it may have been. We may get to the mountaintop one day, my friends. We may never see the promised land.
Well, that's true. That's good. That's a good story. All right. Thanks, buddy. That's great. We're going to bring Dr. Pearson, and we're going to have a chat with her coming up now in the Vicar's Crossing.
Let's welcome her in.
And we are thrilled to be able to welcome into the Vicar's Crossing today Dr. Yolanda Pierce from Washington. And there's Kevin's holding up the book. And Dr. Pierce, thank you so much for giving us the time today. How are you?
I am so excited. I'm just happy to be here. I'm doing great. Thank you.
Great. Good.
You're making your virtual journey to us from Washington. Mm-hmm. We're thrilled that you're with us. We booked this, I don't know, maybe a month ago, something like that. And we couldn't have known when we booked it then that we'd be right back now where we so often are. So I thought the place to begin is with the obvious. This is a bonus episode, and if you're listening to this now for the first day, it's up on Sunday the 18th. But we're recording this on a Wednesday, and we're just 3 days removed from yet again another routine traffic stop that resulted in the death of another Black body, another Black man. We're told it was an accidental shooting. Like, what the living holy hell? And while Dante Wright's family try to come to grips with this horrific homicide, all of Minneapolis is in the grip of this Derek Chauvin trial, as is the entire nation. Certainly we're watching it here in Canada as well. I mean, we had those marches last summer, Black Lives Matter marches, and I'm sorry that we're having this conversation. I'm sorry that this is how we're beginning, Dr. Pierce. It shouldn't have to be. God knows you must be tired of talking about this. You must be exhausted from these questions, this continued violence against Black bodies and the systemic racism in policing and in other parts of society and institutions as well. Tired of being asked, how are you doing? And yet it will be wrong for us to start this today without me asking you and checking in with you and asking for your thoughts and your feelings and your frustrations on this day, as you know, here we are again.
So thank you for asking. And I'm actually glad when people ask, because what I don't want to happen is for this to become so routine that we
Mhm.
really become numb to injustice.
Yeah.
And I think, unfortunately, that's exactly is what happens, that we just say, oh, another shooting, oh, another life loss. But this is someone's child or someone's father or someone's pastor. We don't even know. And so we can't become numb to the kinds of systematic violence that really are a part of the American landscape that is unfortunately baked into the nation's history and its founding. And it is exhausting. And even as exhausting as it is for me, I can't help but think of someone like George Floyd calling for his mother who had passed away, right? And because the trial in America started during Holy Week, I really had to reflect on what it means for this man who has been executed, state sanctioned violence, to
Execution,
call
yeah.
on his mother and to be reminded of Mary at the foot of the cross, right? Her son
Yes.
also crucified, also state sanctioned execution, and to connect the idea of grieving mothers, grieving parents, as part of the work that I do as a theologian, so that I don't become numb to the overwhelming theological significance of what it means when some people don't believe that all of us are made in the image and likeness of God.
Yeah. And I mean, does this, I mean, you're at Howard, you're the Dean of Divinity there. How do you find this manifests itself in your community, like in the student body? And I mean, because this, again, there's a generational trauma that goes with a lot of this. And I think that's part of what you're striking on. I mean, even just thinking of George Floyd crying out to his deceased mother, but you know, in reading your book as well, and we'll get more into that, but there's just generation after generation. And I wonder, when I think about that student body you have at Howard, how does this grief manifest itself?
So many of them have their own stories, their own encounters. Howard University is a historically Black college and university, one of about 100 in this nation, in the United States. And so many of these students have their own sets of trauma, stories that they tell, as well as the faculty and the staff. And so on one hand, it is distinctly this person's story, but it is also sort of the re-wounding, the re-traumatizing, as you think about how close you may have been, that every police stop may in fact mean the end of your life, and what it means to live in that fear, as you're just going about your daily tasks, as you're just driving or picking up your kids or going to work. So there's a certain sensitivity to it in our student body. And as the Dean of a Divinity School, preparing pastors and priests and ministers and people who do pastoral care, a real deep cry about how do we minister to the hurting when we know that there isn't a solution forthcoming very soon.
Right. It's going to be a long haul.
Yes.
In the wake of the murder of George Floyd last May, you know, there was an uprising. You know, some folks in certain political circles like to talk about it as rioting. But I prefer to see it as people saying enough and rising up and finding a voice. Last night and the night before in Minneapolis, again, in the surrounding suburbs, we saw people rising up again in the wake of Daunte Wright's death, murder. In one of the chapters of your book, you write about silence and the need to know when to speak up. And you quote one of my absolute favorites in Audre Lorde. I discovered her just actually last year after George Floyd's murder, because I checked my own bookshelf and my own white privilege and my own, and thought, what the heck, I'm not reading. And I started reading, and Audre Lorde just was like a revelation. She's so amazing. What a great gift she was to the world. And I'm just going to read the bit that you quoted and a question on the other side. I was going to die sooner or later, whether or not I had ever spoken myself, is what Lord writes. My silences had not protected me. Your silences will not protect you. What are the words you do not yet have? What are the tyrannies you swallow day by day and attempt to make your own, until you will sicken and die of them still in silence? we have been socialized to respect fear more than our own need for language. And I just thought, yeah, that's dead on. Now you share that after sharing a story about a young African-American student in first year university where you were teaching a class, and your response to it. I just wonder, and that sort of picks up on the heels of what you were just saying about Howard. And I realize this story doesn't come from Howard, but it comes from another school. But can you share with our listeners what happened that day and how you felt about silence and why silence is really no longer an option? Why we're seeing people, whether they're Black, African American, or allies, Black, Indigenous, persons of color, everybody now, I think more than ever, trying to speak up and say, enough.
Yes. So this is one of my favorite stories, which is it is both heartbreaking and so important. I was teaching a first year seminar, large class of freshman students. They're babies, they were 18 years old, first year of university, really special class. The story basically involves police coming to my classroom with a warrant for an arrest of one of my students, and subsequently arresting him and removing him. And I never found out what happened to him. I inquired. He never returned back to the class. I never saw him again for the years that I was there at the university. But the story really is about silences, right? It is about, I'm struggling in that moment to know what to say, what not to say. How much do I challenge? What do I say to this police officer? Do I dare tell him he can't come into my classroom? Do I dare tell him, no, you can't take this young man? And also what I wanted to say, but couldn't quite find the words to say to this young man,
Right.
as I did inform him that there were police officers outside to arrest him. And so I'm playing with this idea of silence sometimes as a sacred thing. Sometimes we are to be still and listen for God's voice. I think that there's a sacred silence. But then there are also times in which we should speak up, but we don't. And we are silenced and we silence ourselves. And the truth of the matter is that whatever I would have said, the outcome may not have been any different for this particular young man. But that for me, knowing that I'm called to speak into the moment, to speak truth to power, and my failure to do so. So it is, I hope for the readers, a story to get them to think about, when did you remain silent when you should have spoken?
Sure.
When did you fail to be the ally that you could be? Again, sometimes there are sacred silences.
Yes.
And sometimes there is silence in the face of injustice, which is what King talked about quite a bit in his ministry and life.
Well, I felt that, you were very vulnerable in sharing the story. And I was really moved by the story, just in that you actually did speak to these police officers. For the listeners, Dr. Pierce refused to allow them to come. They were going to take this boy before class. And she was like, nope, we're teaching a class here. And you all can wait. Between her and between you and your teaching assistant, you kept him at bay and did your class and did all that. But your sort of introspection in the book about, did I speak? Did I say enough? And all that. It sort of got me thinking about all the times, and particularly for, looking at these three white guys here on the screen, these times that we find ourselves in conversations where we know something needs to be said. And are we willing to pay the price for that? Are we willing to speak up when the inappropriate thing is said, when somebody else is marginalized, when we're again benefiting from our privilege and not stopping to ask, wait a minute, who's doing this again now? Why aren't you asking this person these sorts of things? Right. So I agree with you. I do hope that for a lot of the readers of the book, I believe they will, because it immediately got me thinking about, when am I silent when I shouldn't be?
I was really appreciative of the book, Dr. Pierce. And on a personal note, it's called In My Grandmother's House. And on a personal note, I was recalling that in my undergrad days, when I was in my third year of university, I lived with my grandma for a year. My great grandmother, who I called Nan, and lived in her house, and she was in her early 90s. So that was a very formative time and an influential time. with her, and I know that relationship with your grandmother was sacred as well. And one of the images in your book of the faith that was passed on to you, really modeled for you by your grandmother, they're incredibly moving and evocative. And I was taken by your description of your encounter with Black Jesus. While the community and even the church were replete with images of, and we've all seen them. I grew up with them on my Sunday school wall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, white Jesus, so
Aryan
Jesus, holding the
Aryan
sheep and holding the
six-pack
little
Jesus.
lamb, and
Six-pack
exactly.
Jesus.
That's right. Yeah, six-pack Jesus.
Yeah.
But your grandmother provided for you a very important and personal image of Black Jesus, who was a friend and a confidant. And I'm wondering if you'd be so kind if you could read for us a short excerpt of your book about this, and then I'd like to ask you something on the other side to that.
I'm happy to. One of my favorite passages. So, the Jesus I remember, whose picture was hanging on the wall alongside those of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, was a Black man.
Mm.
Amateur artist unknown, this picture was of a Jesus with burnished skin, curly hair, piercing brown eyes, and an angry look. Years later, when I read James Baldwin's description of Jesus as a, quote, disreputable, sun-baked Hebrew, my mind took me back to the picture that hung in my grandparents' living room. This Black Jesus wasn't lowly, meek, or mild. He had no use for carrying around lambs. He wore a crown of thorns instead of a golden halo. And his hair was a curly afro or twisted locks instead of golden tresses. This childhood image of Black Jesus left such a powerful impression that even today, when I look into the eyes of the Black men in my life, I see the face of Jesus looking back at me. Black Jesus on our wall was an act of solidarity with marginalized people, all those who have had very few tools of resistance against dominant depictions of whiteness, but who have a deep sense that God is on their side.
Mm.
And perhaps even more important than his skin tone was the fact that Black Jesus was a very present help in times of trouble.
Mm-hmm.
A close friend whose name was called in our house again and again.
Amen.
Wow, powerful, powerful. Well, look, we're through Holy Week and Easter a little over a week ago, and some of the most striking images in the media this year, as we listen to the testimony and the evidence at the Derek Chauvin trial, we've been watching it here in Canada as well, were those of George Floyd carrying a cross, or Jesus crying from the cross, "I can't breathe." Can you tell us about how important depictions of Jesus in a Black body has been for you and has become for so many in America right now?
So, as a womanist theologian, one of the things that's important for me is to disrupt certain normative claims that we make about who God is, who Jesus was, right?
Yeah.
And the disruption of those claims is to allow space for others to enter into the conversation and to sit at the table. And so, one of the first questions that is often asked of African American people who, of course, were brought to the United States as enslaved persons, really as chattel, is how did you start to worship a God who does not look like you, right? And so these depictions and our fine art and our stained glass, really lovely, right? Artistic icons, but a God who does not look like them. And so I wanted to be very, very clear that I think for so many men and women, including my grandparents, that they had it very clearly in their head that Jesus looked like them, loved them. Jesus walked with the least of these, right? And so that was so important to me because while they would not have considered themselves theologians, they certainly weren't theologically trained the way that we formally think about theology, somehow inherent to their faith system was a disruptive set of beliefs so that if God is for us, God looks like us. I think that that's powerful for people to see themselves in the image and the likeness of God. So this isn't to debate, right, what I think Jesus should be depicted as. It is to say that everyone should have a sense that God looks like them, that they look like God. What the Quakers would say is there is that of God in everyone, right? That divine spark in everyone. And so my grandparents had that, and they gave that to me. And that, I want to suggest, is such a powerful gift.
Yeah, very much so. Other parts of the book in describing your grandmother as well and her many gifts, you write about how she discipled with food, which
A lot
is
of food. There was a lot of
fantastic.
food.
A lot of food.
Growing up,
Yeah,
yes.
big time.
Praise
Um,
Jesus. I'm all about
Yes,
that.
I'm with that. The
Look at
ministry of
this.
macaroni and cheese.
Hey, and didn't Jesus love gathering people around a table, right? So there you go.
Absolutely.
And she was a cook who worked from scratch with whatever she had. And I wanted to read just a little excerpt about that for our listeners today, too. You write in your book, cooking was my grandmother's ministry. And I witnessed as she ministered to the lonely and the sick and the lost with the Bible in one hand and a freshly baked pound cake in the other. That's a
Amen.
great image. Yeah, wonderful. She fed everyone who came within a 50-foot radius of our door, always greeting people with both food and scripture. She told me that Jesus consistently did three things: healed people, told stories, and fed people. And that is all she, as a follower of Jesus, had to do in order to live a life pleasing to God. The food from my grandmother's kitchen healed people, not because of the ingredients, but because the person who prepared that food was never afraid to sit with the sick and the dying. She was never too busy or too tired to feed welcome guests and strangers. What a great image of the kingdom, the kingdom that has come.
The
You
simplicity of
describe
it.
and you describe in the book the day you asked your grandmother if it might be easier to do all of this work with a food processor. And she didn't answer you right away. But eventually she did, with words that prompted you to consider, when there is no outside help, you can still perform the task to which you have been assigned. When you have a few scraps like food or fabric or money, strength, you can with your hands make them into something even more. Can you share a little bit more about that story and her answer and the wisdom that it imparts on us today?
There was a beautiful simplicity to her faith. And when I say simplicity, I'm not suggesting that it was so simplistic, right, that it wasn't undergirded, right, by deep belief. But when she taught me, like, you want to be a follower of Jesus, all of these things there are a few things. Are you feeding people? Are you caring for people, right? And so growing up with this faith that was deeply simplistic, but was also life-changing and transformative for the folks around us. And then growing up in poverty, which is that was my story growing up. And so these were poor folk. These were poor African Americans, the inner city in Brooklyn, New York. But the ability for these men and women to make something from nothing. So the process of quilting scraps of fabric, right, that you put together and can make a beautiful quilt, or cooking. I don't know how she created feasts from, I would look in the fridge. We all do this, right? We go in the refrigerator, we look in there, and there's nothing to eat. And just sit back down, right? Because there's food in there, it's just nothing to eat. And somehow she would open the refrigerator and she would find something and cook it up. And so I was thinking about the lessons that we learn, the wisdom that come from the elders, the wisdom that come from those who have very little, but really depend on God to provide. And then also the second piece of this, which is an astounding generosity. I have found in my own life that the poorest people on the planet are often the most generous.
That's the truth.
They will share, as I've traveled the world, literally traveled the world, and in countries where poverty unknown to most North Americans, right? I have found they're the most generous people on the planet, will share their last bit of rice, their last noodle. And so I was seeing God in flesh here, right? The willingness to share the last, the willingness to say that if I eat, you eat, because that's what it means to be in community with one another.
Yeah.
And that's a powerful, powerful thing that has really stayed with me.
Yeah, one of the great gifts I find in parish ministry is that there are so many people that I'm in relationship with within the parish, that they're the quiet ones that I know are doing that type of powerful transformative ministry, and you'd never even know that they're in the room half the time, right? Like they're not the ones that are going to be leading Bible studies or getting into arguments about theologies of the atonement and all this kind of stuff that we get all wound up in.
Yes.
But there's stories of, of being at a park and taking their to have lunch and taking their sandwich out of their lunch and going over and handing it to the person that they knew didn't have food. Like that kind of stuff is just so powerful and transformative, and it's something that needs to be drawn attention to, because it does happen quietly, which is good, but I see that a lot.
These are quietly, these are, and I thought of this reading about your grandmother, Dr. Pierce, but it too, because these are quietly the disciples, right? Like these are the people who are, like there's my grandmother's Bible right here. It sits on my desk. And when you just mentioned about making things from scraps, like quilts, like my grandmother used to hand sew these quilts with pieces she'd take off of altered clothing or pants that were worn out and then got cut up. And I remember as a kid, we all had a quilt of my grandmother's, and she grew up in poverty and didn't have anything. And so, we had quilts, and I can remember lying under my nan's quilt, and I could see the sleeve. She wanted a sleeveless dress. She couldn't afford it. So she bought one with sleeves in it and cut the sleeves out. And but the part of the sleeve was on there. Part of my grandfather's corduroy pants was on there, and so you get wrapped in this love. And if there was somebody in the community who was in need of a warm blanket, she made it, that's just the way it worked, and we, as Rob said, we get bogged down in all kinds of sort of, ecclesial arguments about all kinds of different things. But this sort of really, this manifest love of God is expressed largely in women. And I know for you as a womanist theologian in the United States, in terms of the Black church and the expression of Black women, and thinking right now about the influence that Black women of faith had in the last election, for instance, that these sorts of relationships that are built on a grassroots level often have earth-shattering potential. And I think that that's what we saw in that last election. I think that it was the women, Stacey Abrams and what she accomplished in Georgia was amazing. Yeah.
I love what you just said, because talking about your nan and these scraps and these quilts, because also what I see built into this, right, as a theologian, is a wonderful environmental justice ethic. Which is that you reuse, you recycle, right? And so my grandmother did the same thing. Worn out T-shirts. Okay, well you rip it up and you make it into rags to clean the house, or you use a part and you quilt, or you right. Everything was just reused because that's what poor folks do, right?
That's right.
But it's an environmental ethic as well, which is to say that we care for the things that we have, and the furniture might be old, but you polish it with love, right?
That's right.
And you keep it for generations, and you reuse something, and so the chicken bone, because you're just like, there's no more chicken on that chicken bone. They're like, I'm gonna make some soup. I'm like, there is no more chicken on that bone. I can still make some soup with it, right? And so what I'm really trying to say is that in these lessons that I was receiving in my growing up years, I did not know would be deeply theological principles that I would later teach, right, in the academy and university, and now here at a divinity school. And so you're right, we want to have lots of theological arguments and debates, and my favorites are about baptism, immersion, sprinkling. We could go on for days about
dunk
them. Yeah, I come from a tradition.
Get them,
put them in
get them wet,
water.
get them wet.
You're still dry. You're not baptized. But I said, oh, wow. Even though I didn't have a name for an environmental ethic or a sacramental theology or a different kind of soteriology, I was watching it.
You saw it
in
real
my
life.
childhood.
It was manifest.
Also, but sorry, did I interrupt you, Rob?
No, go ahead.
Okay, cool. Well, it's also like kind of like working with your hands as well, like that sort of meditative, also sort of feeling. And I have a question that sort of builds off of that. But first, I want to we'll jump around and come back to that. So a lot of people have been raised with this image of God that is like patriarchal and punitive, right? And you write about what you grew up with and what you had to let go of. Would you read for us a little bit of that passage from chapter 3 of your book, The Work of Her Hands? And then after that, I'll ask that question.
Thank you. So I let go of a wrathful God, a God lurking around every corner and waiting to punish me for any infraction, and began to embrace a loving God who looked beyond my faults and saw my needs. I let go of deeply embedded homophobia, xenophobia, patriarchy, biases that had been unconsciously transmitted to me all my life, and began to embrace a generous, affirming, and liberatory faith. I let go of the denials of all pleasure, the castigation of the body, the rebuke of the frivolous and silly, and began to embrace the joys of simple pleasures and healthy satisfactions. I let go of the arrogant confidence that had been instilled in me, that what I had been taught was the only right, true, and holy way, and that there was no other path, and began to embrace the most important theological posture that any believer can have. God is beyond my comprehension, and waiting on God is simply the best I can do.
That's lovely. That's so nice. Yeah. So you finished that chapter with love in all its wonders. Sorry, let me try that again. You finished that chapter with love in all its wondrous forms is a gift, and that the loving hands of a grandmother braiding hair, the burn-scarred hands of someone baking pies, and the tender hands of one's beloved are all God's beautiful work. Can you say more about waiting on God and seeing God in a very hands-on sort of way, if you pardon the joke?
I love it. I love it. And thank you for drawing attention to this passage, because one of the things that I want to be clear about is that we also have to let go of some things. I was raised in the Holiness Pentecostal tradition. I was raised in a tradition that was deeply legalistic, deeply patriarchal, had its own biases against a wide variety of things. And I needed to let go of that. And which is not to say that what I inherited isn't beautiful, but it is to say that I really had to find God for myself. And that's the best of traditions, which is there's something that you can inherit and there's some things that you have to find for yourself. And so instead of this angry, wrathful God who's trying to punish me for every sin, and I'm just a sinner in the hands of an angry God, kind of like, oh, looking around me and I can't go. Instead, I really started thinking about a God who holds my hand. You hold the hand of someone you love. Right? It's a gesture of intimacy and connection. And so I said, that's the God I want to serve, a God who loves me deeply and isn't trying to punish me and beat me up and send me to hell, but is saying that if you trust me enough, if you place your hand in my hand, the road might be rocky. We're going to do this together.
Right.
And so I think that as a theologian, but also as a person of faith, I can critique. I think critique is healthy. And I had to offer a critique to a number of ways. The lack of affirmation for difference in the community in which I was raised, this kind of just unconscious bias against queer folk. It was just baked into it. And I need us to be honest about that. And I needed to be honest about that. And I had to let go of that so that my relationship with God is genuine. And so I'm not trying to restrict or constrict anyone else's theology, but I know what I needed to let go of in order to have a more affirming approach to doing this work of being a Christian.
You know what was really moving for me in reading that was just, again, I found myself thinking about the things I was raised with, that we all were raised with. And in the current climate, in the current conversation about Black, Indigenous, and persons of color and the unconscious biases that are baked in, it's one thing to say I was raised with it, but at some point it becomes willful ignorance. And so your own, ability to sort of reflect on your being raised in the holiness movement, for instance, I wonder if I could follow up with a question, I guess, in a way, because one of the things that strikes me is that I found most sort of intriguing was your very just a incredible reflection on, being a child and being or a young woman and being instructed by the women of the church, about your clothing and about what to wear and all this. And that for a lot of your life, that felt like a very narrow, restrictive thing. But you had a further reflection on that sort of spoke to being in a Black body and what those women were doing for you. Can you share a little bit about that?
Sure. So a very legalistic tradition. I
Yeah.
grew up with church mothers. Church mothers within the African American context is sometimes the actual church office and ecclesial office, other times just kind of a tradition in which the elder women teach the younger women. And so there were a number of church mothers at my church growing up. They were in their 60s or 70s. And so, wow, did they monitor the young women in the church. I just felt like, whoa, so your skirt is too short, or I heard you were talking to a boy, or I'm like, how did you even hear that? Like, I hadn't even talked to him yet. I was going
People
to
are like
wow. They had magic. I just didn't know what
these women are like the FBI.
They knew everything. I was like, are they tapping the phone? Right. And so here are these traditions. And so I just, like any teenager would, I just rejected it. And this is just legalism. And so I got to college and I had words like patriarchy and hegemony. And I was like, it's these crazy old fashioned women who were just trying to keep me from being. So then life happens, right?
Then life happens.
And so as I'm reading more and learning more about my own history, most of these women came to cities in the North, second wave of Great Migration of African Americans leaving the rural South to come north to New York and Chicago and Philadelphia. What I now know is that for the vast majority of these women, leaving former plantations, leaving lives where their parents had been sharecroppers, literally only 2 generations removed from slavery, they had been so vulnerable to rape and sexual assault and all manner of things that unfortunately they were so ashamed to talk about. And so with a grown-up eye, I understood a little bit differently. What these women were trying to do, and it doesn't make what they did right, but what they were trying to do was actually to protect me. I thought that they were trying to control me. They actually believed that they were trying to protect me. They wanted to say I was marked as a daughter of the church. And so they needed the people, the predators inside the church and the predators outside the church to know that this is one of our daughters. You could tell by how she's dressed, and we love her. We're going to fight for her in a world that doesn't really fight for little Black girls.
Right.
And so on one hand, patriarchy is real. Legalism is real. They really, really did give me a hard time. They really, really made my teenage years really tough. But I also now know, learning a little bit about their lives and stories and history, is that they used the tools that they had.
That's right.
For their survival and my survival.
It wasn't as though they had come up in a day when you could say, you know what, don't tell me about what to wear. Talk to the man about not, objectifying me and doing that. Conversation wasn't being had. I mean, we're pushing to have it now. So, so I just thought that level of insight on your part was really like, it was an incredible insight. I just, and again, I want to affirm what you're saying, that it didn't make it right, but it does lend some context to just what was happening and what an act of love these women were offering with the best that they had. Again, with whatever they had at their disposal, they were going to show the world that you were claimed. You're one of God's own and protected under that love. And that was going to be no matter what.
We have a different set of tools, all of us in 2021, right? We have some language, we've read some books, we've had Me Too movements, right?
Yes, right.
We've had a number of things. These are women in the 90s born and really at the end of the Great Depression. These are the tools that they had to protect.
Right. One of the chapters in your book was in regard to sacraments, and I wanted to ask you a bit about that. those of us in the Anglican or Episcopalian traditions are familiar with that word very much so, but
Our
perhaps
ears perk up when we hear sacraments.
sacraments.
Ooh, I'm
We're
so
having a
excited.
sacrament. Yeah.
Let's talk about some sacraments. Dr. Pierce is going to talk about sacraments. I got to read that chapter.
That's right. That's right. But yeah, for us getting all excited, but perhaps not a word that conjures up a lot in holiness traditions, as you were explaining growing up. And picking up from that last conversation about hands-on revelations of God that we were chatting about, you describe how you've encountered sacrament in the ordinary. And you write a powerful story of an ordinary thing, burlap bags, as well as an incredible testimony about ordinary objects like towels, a pitcher, a basin, a vial of oil, and all put to use for extraordinary acts of service. Would you share a little bit about these sacramental stories with our listeners today?
So I love that your ears perked up, because I love talking about sacraments and sacramental theology. And it wasn't certainly a term that I was acquainted with, growing up in the church. And it wasn't something I actually even knew anything about until I started learning and studying theology. But my church actually did have two recognized sacraments, and one was foot washing. And one was anointing with oil, and so there were foot washing services regularly. Now, again, I reflect on this on one hand as a teenager. No teenager anywhere ever wants anything to do with feet.
No, no,
nothing to do
not
with
happening.
feet, whatever. Even if you're on the couch watching the movie, please put the feet away. Just
Can we go to church and have our feet washed, Mom?
Like, what in the world? Like, so as a kid, I was like, oh, not the feet. Like, oh, can we just do anything else, right? But the feet. But foot washing was a very powerful sacrament, and like I said, I've really come to appreciate it. I've come to appreciate that the posture of foot washing, and I literally mean that, which is you're kneeling. You're pouring the water. It's very simple. It doesn't require any really special words. It doesn't require certain kind of ordinances. But these were the sacraments I grew up. And so one of the things that I wanted to say to those who are reading it, who may have come from holiness Pentecostal traditions, is that there are sacraments within your tradition. And then I also wanted to connect with folks like you all who come from very deeply sacramental traditions to say, this is what we share. We share a sense that God shows up in ordinary things, right? And so that wine, that bread, that cup, just ordinary things. We have cups in the house, bread in the house, wine in the house, right? But we think something extraordinary happens when we gather at table for the Eucharist. So I love this idea of the sacramental connecting us across our different ecclesial and denominational differences.
Right. Yeah. And oftentimes being in that sacramental spaces, and I love the term thin spaces. It's like, where that space where the heavenly and the worldly kind of connect, and there's a little thin space in there. And I can't tell you, I've seen, distributing little flat pieces of dried out bread into someone's hand and watching them break down in tears. Like being in that thin space is so powerful, right? And
it is the mystery. It is the mystery, and I love that space.
Right, or we don't do it enough. We wash feet on Holy Thursday, and in this congregation here, everybody lines up and come up. Even the teenagers, believe it or not, but they all sort of take the turn. But it's powerful when it happens. Like, it's just incredibly powerful. And our church doesn't describe it as sacrament, sadly. Phil Jacob, who's from the Iona community, who came and did something for us here in this deanery not so long ago, he actually had a foot washing at the end of his of that sort of weekend mission and talked about it as sacrament. And this is a Roman Catholic church liturgist, but he talked about it as sacrament in the same manner that you do in the book, in the sense that we're taking very ordinary things and are giving a picture, a window into a very sacred thing, an outward invisible sign of an inward and invisible grace, right? So it just is powerful. I wonder if you can share the story about the burlap shirt, because I found that just incredible. again, a tear.
Thank you. So, as a scholar, I work with 18th and 19th century narratives from slavery. Had written a book called Hell Without Fire, a different book, Hell Without Fires, on the spiritual narratives that emerge out of slavery. So I've been studying this material for my entire career. There's this one particular story that stayed with me, which is that enslaved children on a plantation weren't given clothing, right? Clothing was an expensive thing in the 18th and 19th century. And so in a fairly warm weather climate, these enslaved children were not given clothing. They could not work for their keep. And so what the parents would do is that they would take burlap sacks, right? The stuff that the wheat and burlap came in, and they would make clothing for their children. But burlap is very rough and scratchy and coarse. It's a terrible, terrible material. A young enslaved man chose to wear this burlap sack to soften it in order to give it to his younger brother. And that sacrifice for me reading this story, it was so powerful. I mean, even now it brings tears to my eyes, because dealing with these stories and the legacy of slavery, and as a person who is of course a descendant of slavery, but when I think about God's sacrificial love, I think of this story all the time, which is to say that God isn't asking us to be crucified on the cross, but God is asking us sometimes for acts of sacrificial love. And so what it meant for this older brother to say, I'll wear this until it softens up because I love you and I don't want you to have to rub your tender young skin, right? And it's a really powerful story that comes out of one of the narratives of slavery. And I really hopefully use it to talk about the ways in which I see my faith and I see how we can talk about sacrifice.
Yeah, it's incredible. I wonder, I mean, we're coming near the end here, but I just wonder if we can wrap today with you reading about the Great Cloud of Witnesses. There's so much in this book, which just gave me so much to remember and think about and be challenged. But you write about the cloud of witnesses and how important that is to know that we've ancestors who speak our names, and I just found that affirming and reassuring. You write about calling the names of our ancestors and how important that is. And so if you would read this section, and then I'll pick up with a question on the other side, but this is another part of the book which I found really profound.
Thank you. Okay. To call on the name of my ancestors is to never forget the horror they faced. We need to speak the names of these witnesses who are not found in the biblical texts or the history books. We need to speak their names because the ancestors never die unless we fail to remember them. Speak the name of that teacher who inspired you. Speak the name of the grandmother who raised you. Speak the name of the neighbor who always had a kind word for you. Speak the names of those aunties who schooled you. Speak the names of those you love and have never forgotten. And when you cannot speak their names, when you do not even know their names, whisper a prayer of thanks that your life, with all its failures and successes, may be your ancestors' wildest dream.
Now, isn't that beautiful, Robbie?
That's incredible. Yeah, I love that. I just absolutely love that. Yeah,
it's so, I pulled that out and I said, this I will use with grieving families. I mean, this is so critically important. And I can't help but sort of finish where we started, which is to say, in the wake of the violent deaths of Black men and women, we've heard the cry to say their names, right? Say his name, say her name. Because again, just as you've said in that poignant part of the book, they live on in us, and they may not be from Genesis or Exodus or, the Acts of the Apostles. They may not be in church history, but each of these people in their own way, as you said at the beginning, is somebody's son, somebody's daughter, somebody's auntie, somebody's uncle. These are folks who have important stories of God's making. These are people who are parts of the fabrics of families all across America who've been snuffed out in an instant and have left behind grieving families and communities who are hurting. And so, Michael Brown, Eric Gardner, Ayanna Jones, Philando Castro, Tamir Rice, Walter Scott, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Dante Wright. And this is but to scratch the surface. In the last 18 or 24 months alone, these names I've just said, this list is hardly a dent when we talk about what's happening with Black bodies and police brutality right now. Can you say a little bit more about the importance of calling out these names?
So, like many of you all, raised in a tradition where certain prayers would begin with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Right? And we invoke that, and it's beautiful. But I was that unfortunate contrary kid in Sunday school who would raise my hand. That's why they sent me to the adult Sunday school. They were sick of me. And because the question fundamentally I wanted to ask was, why was it okay to call on the names of someone else's ancestors, but not my own?
Not your own.
I believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I am a Christian, and I am so proud to be a member of the body of Christ. But those are not my ancestors. That is that, we call it the roll call of faith, right? So the passage in Hebrew where you call on all of these wonderful names. Those aren't my ancestors. And so I wanted a space to give permission to people to say, call on your ancestors, call on the folks in your past, the people who've raised you, the people who loved you. And as a person of African descent, because I in fact cannot trace my lineage beyond slavery, my family lineage gets interrupted by enslavement, to also say that the ancestors are not the people that you're related to solely by blood. And so for me, the Harriet Tubmans or the Nat Turners or the Fannie Lou Hamers, I claim them also as ancestors. But I wanted a moment to give Christians in particular permission to say, you get to call on the God of your grandmother. You get to call on the God of your father, because that is the same God. And so Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or the God of Sarah and Leah and Hannah, those are beautiful invocations in our faith. But I also get to call on the God of Vivian, the God of the woman who raised me and taught me who God is and loved me to wholeness, and that I honor her by speaking her name. And so this movement of say her name, say his name, is to honor those who may not be with us anymore, but continue to live in our memory as long as we keep saying their names.
Right. Powerful.
I just,
That's wonderful.
I mean, I'm almost without words, which takes something for me. I got to tell you, I'm full of it. I'm full of a lot of stuff, to be honest. But you are such a gift, Dr. Pierce, and your book, I can't recommend it enough to folks to get this book and read it. It will inspire your own faith. It'll call you to remember things, and it'll call you to let go of things, and it will call you to embrace things, and it will call you to live more closely to those who disciple in the most meaningful and simple, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but the most simple and loving ways. And congratulations on a great book, and thank you for the work that you're doing at here and at Howard. And every time I turn on the TV and see you, I get excited because now it'll be like,
now we're going to be like, I know her.
We know her. And now we expect your webpage to have, guest on the Vicar's Crossing on it too, because it's such an important space. Right?
My accolades. I thank you so much. I just want to express a word of appreciation, because part of what I'm also trying to say is that I'm writing about my grandmother. I'm writing about this particular cultural Black space, but I really, really hope and pray that that this is something accessible
I think
to
it is.
all kinds of folks. And so you all sharing with me this afternoon has been such a blessing to me, because it's actually the same story. We share the same stories. We might come from very, very different
That's right.
backgrounds, different racial and ethnic identities, but we share a story. And so it is important to me to have these conversations to remind people we share a story, and that's God's grace. And so thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Dr. Yolanda Pierce, our guest today. In My Grandmother's House is the book, and we thank Dr. Pierce for her time. That was a wonderful conversation, and really looking forward to getting my teeth into that one for sure.
Well, you won't be disappointed, and neither will anybody else out there listening. Pick it up. Go to the books tab on our webpage, thevicarscrossing.com. That's right. Thevicarscrossing.com. There's a tab called Books, and there's a direct link to all the books of all our guests. And you'll be able to find details about the book right there. And you won't be disappointed.
All right. Thanks to our sponsors again, to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London, Middlesex, both family owned and operated, to Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, locally owned, locally operated, locally loved, and to Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. Guys, thanks very much. I'm Rob Henderson from Holy Trinity St. Stephen's.
Kevin George, St. Aidan's Church.
My name is Ian. Hello, everyone.
And we thank you for listening to the bonus episode. We'll have more coming up next week. And until we get together again, Kevin, remember to always look both ways
before you cross the street.
Thank you for listening. Our hosts are Kevin George and Rob Henderson. Our producer and composer is myself, Ian, with original artwork done by Elizabeth Dodman. If you have any questions or want to know where to find us, tweet us at Vickers Crossing or find us on Facebook at The Vickers Crossing. If you have any other questions about anything heard on this podcast, leave us a comment or look in the description to find out more. Thanks!